Hello everyone, this is Kat and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfic. This is the continuation of Swallow the Stars. This will be part 18, chapter 18, entitled The Discomfort of Growth. Filing a formal complaint. Blatant abuse of power. Request for immediate termination. Shota scrubs his hands over his face and sighs heavily. 12 complaint forms sit on his desk in front of him, white slips of accusations that he's not taking his job seriously when that couldn't be further from the truth. It's nothing that he hasn't dealt with before. It's just never been on this scale. His reputation for being a hard-ass first-year homeroom teacher who expels at least one student without fail every year is well known across all of Japan, and if rumors are to be believed, he's reached the status of being a boogeyman-esque figure in the United States, too. It's not like the reputation is unfounded. He is a hard-ass, and he does expel at least one student every year, but it's not like he does it for a power trip. Some kids, and sometimes most kids, aren't ready for the world of heroics. There's a fine line between raising future heroes and training child soldiers, and Shota is probably more aware of that than maybe any other teacher at UA, except perhaps Izashi. Kids who haven't tasted defeat, kids who think that they can coast through the hero course and instantly become rich. The only thing that they're walking towards is death. So Shota kills them, before any villain can. And sometimes, if he's really lucky, the kids learn from the experience and go on to do great things. Hell, there's a sidekick in Hokkaido right now who approached Shota 2 months after he'd expelled him as a student, who thanked him for doing so. Shota had immediately put in the kid's general education application himself, and the next year, after a brilliant showing at the sports festival, they were back in the hero course. More often than not, though, the students that Shota expels don't learn, which is how he gets stuck with letters of complaints. Of course, it's not his job to respond to them, but Nezu has a cruel streak and makes Shota read the letters anyway, and right now he doesn't have an excuse not to, seeing as he expelled his entire homeroom this year within the first 2 weeks of class. None of them had been taking the course seriously, not even the recommendation student. Their casual attitudes about training and studying had frayed Shota's last nerve, especially when he had gone home to his son, who puts his hours upon hours of work and training into his body and his analysis, and a quirk that isn't even a quirk, that is so much worse than a quirk, and still maintains excellent grades and cares about people around him. God, and then Shinso, too, who's grown so much in the last year that he's hardly recognizable as the boy with the bruised jaw and split lip, all long legs and elbows, who Shota had met when picking up Izuku from his first and only detention. The thought of his 20 lackluster, careless students becoming pro-heroes had twisted Shota's gut too much for him to handle it, so out the door they all went. Groaning, Shota leans back in his chair and stares up at the ceiling. He desperately needs a nap, which, of course, means that the door of the teacher's lounge opens in that moment, admitting Hisashi and Namuri with Snipe trailing a few paces behind. Hisashi makes his way over to the low counter along the side of the room, and Namuri waltzes into Shota's office and plants herself on his desk, just to the left of all the paperwork he's tired of reading. "You're not allowed to look like that," she proclaims, reaching out to poke his cheek. "You expelled your whole homeroom. You have fewer teaching duties now than the rest of us do." Shota leans away from her finger with a scowl. "Wow, yes, the entire 30 minutes in the morning, that was my homeroom. None of you have to teach in an empty classroom either." He sighs, scratching at the stubble along his jaw. "Nezu's making me face the consequences of my actions." Namuri turned to look at the scattered papers, hair falling into her face, and frowns. You'd think that the parents would stop being so surprised after a while. She picks up one of the papers to read through it. I mean, I know that this year was a bit unexpected, but they have to know that just because their kid has a cool quirk doesn't mean that they're completely immune to failure. "You would think," Shota agrees, but no one expects their kid to be the one to go home, and Shota can only imagine that many of the parents have contacted each other and complained and felt wronged, probably all 12 listed in the paperwork in front of him. Izashi walks in then, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He sets one down on Shota's desk and takes a sip from his own. Shota takes the coffee immediately. "Maybe I should have married you," he says a thank you without the actual words. "Not too late," Izashi winks at him, but there's no real flirting there, nothing romantic. Any chance they'd had of romance died with Oboro. Grief does shit to people, and it doesn't always bring the survivors closer together. Thankfully, luckily, it hadn't ruined their friendship. Sometimes, though, sometimes it does bring people together. Izuku and Shinso have become practically inseparable in the last 10 months, and it's not even due to the time that they spend together, because they still go to school, study sometimes, and otherwise only see each other Friday evenings and Saturday mornings. But when they are together, it's like they've been surgically attached. More often than not, they're touching in some way, a hand firmly planted on a shoulder, index fingers hooked together, one of them supporting the other's weight, and they're always on alert, covering the other's blind spots. Part of Shota's happy to see it, because it's growth for both of them, because it means that they have someone their own age to trust, but the other part of Shota hurts because it had all been brought on too quickly by trauma and grief. Izuku had never had nightmares as bad as he did for the 2 months after the kidnapping. He started seeing Kiyumi-san once per week again after having dropped back to only once per month. Panic attacks became more common, and oftentimes they were easy to pull him out of, but other times they had stretched until Shota had to call Shinzo to use his quirk on Izuku over the phone just to get him to breathe. He's better now, back to how he had been, mostly at least, outwardly. Shota sees the ghost behind his eyes, though, and he understands that there are things that Izuku remembers now, past trauma that he had blocked out before. This past October had been hell, but they'd gotten through it with carefully choreographed movements and zero physical contact and lots of hot chocolate sipped in silence on nights when neither of them could sleep. Nemuri scoffs and flicks away the complaint that she'd been reading. If the kids can't humble themselves and muster up the courage to ask for a second chance, they never would have made it to graduation. They're not ready. Her eyes glint. Then, looking between Shota and Hisashi, "Not like your two boys." Hisashi puffs up all proud and grins. "They're really something, my little listeners." He's been working more with both of them lately since he has more experience dealing with destructive quirks and is more than capable with hand-to-hand. In a couple of months, trainings are going to be split. Friday evenings will still be for sparring, but Saturdays are going to be for Izuku to test the limits of control, and for Shinzo to practice handling his new capture weapon, which Shota has not showed him yet, and will continue to not show him until the moment that the new training schedule goes into effect. The last thing he needs is for his student to start overworking himself in an effort to master a new technique. "I miss my nephew." Nemuri pouts. She kicks at Shota's legs and sticks out her lower lip. "Shota, let me come over soon to see my nephew." Shota's eyes roll, more dramatic than usual. "You just saw him at Christmas." They've been incredibly busy lately, pushing through schoolwork and an increase in patrols due to an uptick in villain activity. "That was almost 5 months ago." She whips around toward Hisashi and points her finger sternly at him. "You better invite me over, and not tell him so that when he shows up to dinner he can't say anything against it." Hisashi laughs, booming, almost loud enough to be from quirk usage, but when he leans in conspiratorially, his voice is remarkably quiet. "You know, that's a great idea. Wouldn't even be that difficult. He's always exhausted Friday nights. I'm sure he'll forget all about this conversation in a week or two." "I would just leave," Shota says, deciding to nip that oncoming train wreck in the bud, before reaching out to organize the complaint letters into a neat stack. "Not before I grabbed Izuku from you." She smacks at Shota on the shoulder, bright-eyed and smiling widely. "Honestly, my grumpy little kohai." "I am not your kohai." "Why are you so bad at sharing?" The real question is, why are his friends so extroverted and bothersome? "Fine. You know what? You can come over and run Shinzo into the ground on Friday, and I'll get to laugh when Izuku kicks your ass." Shota knows that Izuku could, too, at least the first spar. Nemuri has a tendency to underestimate people she thinks are cute, and she thinks that Izuku is adorable, which is arguably true, so she definitely wouldn't see his attacks coming. And fighting quirkless isn't exactly Nemuri's forte either, since she relies a lot on her quirk putting people to sleep from a distance, but Izuku does it all the time. Nemuri laughs delightedly and claps her hands together. "Oh, absolutely! I can't wait to meet Izuku's little friend." A knock on the door interrupts their conversation, and Shota turns to see ectoplasm, or more likely, one of his clones, standing on the other side of the threshold. "Aizawa, Nezu wants to see you." Of course he does. All right. When ectoplasm or his clone leaves, Shota levels a blank stare at Hisashi. "Shoot me now." Unfortunately, his friend just laughs and pulls him to his feet before pushing him out the door. Today sucks. Nezu's waiting for him, paws folded, when Shota enters his office. "Aizawa-san, good to see you. Thank you for coming. Please close the door." The rat looks far too gleeful for this time of day, any time of day. Shota really, really needs a nap. "I trust you've looked over the letters of complaint by now." Shota drops into a chair across from Nezu's desk and slouches. It takes every scrap of his self-control to not glare at the principal. "I read them. They're just as bullshit as all the others." He tilts his head. "You can fire me if you want, though." It's not as if he doesn't care about teaching. He likes teaching, a shocking amount, actually, and he knows he's good at it even if he still finds that fact about himself baffling. Nezu smiles, though it's more of a baring of teeth. "If I had any intention of firing you, I never would have hired you in the first place." Which is why Shota knows that any expulsion he puts forth that gets approved is not going to get him in trouble. It's also why he likes Nezu the little bit that he does. The rat is always several steps ahead of whichever game is currently being played by those around him. "I actually didn't summon you here to talk about your lack of a homeroom at all." "Oh? Shota had certainly assumed that their discussion topic would be about how to redirect the focus of parents, or if any students were fit to be readmitted to UA through the General Education Department. As always, though, Nezu is playing his own games, regardless of what his pawns are doing. I'll get straight to the point. Nezu sets down his cup of tea and folds his paws. Why haven't you put in the paperwork to get Izuku set up for the recommendation exam? Shota's glad that he is not drinking any tea, because he's sure that he would have either spit it out or choked on it. You know why, he says as calmly as possible. Nezu grimaces and waves his hand. Yes, he doesn't really have a quirk. He's afraid of hurting other people. You don't want him so far into the spotlight. Have I covered everything? Mostly. There's also the fact that Izuku won't want to get into UA on recommendation when Shinso, who is just as talented and skilled in different ways, if anything, will not be included in that recommendation. He could be. Izashi would absolutely be more than happy to recommend him, but there's a certain amount of prestige that goes along with being a recommendation student. Every adult recommending their child has a pedigree and a certain amount of influence, a line of pro-heroes or important figureheads at their backs. Shinso would have none of that, and he would be facing down a room full of people who would likely take one look at his quirk and deem him unfit. It would be a blow to his confidence that Shota isn't willing to risk. With Izuku, at least, he legally has both Shota and Hisashi behind him. Two pro-heroes with impressive track records, and that's not even covering that Izuku's quirk, for all that it is not one, is impressively destructive, and exactly something that would make everyone in the room keep their opinions to themselves. No one would dare argue that Izuku doesn't deserve a recommendation spot with a quirk like that, but they would also immediately be drawn into what Izuku's history is, the mystery behind a boy raised by Shota himself. He had really hoped to avoid the recommendation exam altogether. Izuku wants to take the regular exam, Shota says. Aizawa-san. Nezu has a sharp look in his eyes now, tea forgotten near his elbow. You and I both know just how special Izuku is. Quirk aside, his mind alone would get him into UA. Through general education initially, yes, but I've no doubt that he'd be on the podium for the sports festival and quickly on his way to the hero course. But that power of his... Nezu tuts, shaking his head slowly. He has your surname, Aizawa-san. It would not take a genius to realize that Izuku is your son, that you have raised him and trained him. To not enter him through recommendations will raise questions that none of us will be able to answer, and then those questions will lead to more questions, which will in turn lead to theories, which could lead to tabloid articles and far too much attention for a young hero hopeful. Putting Izuku through the recommendation exam is not only in his best interest, it is logical. Something that I assumed you would approve of. He tilts his head, studying Shota carefully, before giving a soft hum. Whatever conclusion he comes to, he doesn't share. Instead, Nezu grabs a folder off the corner of his desk and slides it across to Shota. He doesn't have to open the folder to know that it holds the paperwork for the recommendation exam, and then something clicks in Shota's mind. You care about him, he says, blinking through the discovery. Not just as a puzzle. You actually care about him. He should have realized this sooner, he thinks. Nezu, the most intelligent being in the world, the busy principal of UA, personally offered to take Izuku into his office and under his wing when Shota couldn't watch him at school the first year that Izuku came to live with him. Looking back on it, Nezu frequently asked after Izuku's well-being and happiness. He gave a phone call both to Shota and Izuku after the kidnapping. He bought Izuku a birthday present for God's sake. Thankfully, for the both of them, Nezu doesn't even pretend to indicate otherwise. I feel a kinship with him. We have similar histories, after all, and his mind really is fascinating. I've never met someone so naturally analytically inclined. I'm already thinking about mentoring him personally during his second year, just to see how elastic he is, how much data he can compile. Horrifying, but fine. Shota was once a personal student of Nezu's, even if only for a single term. I have a theory that he's already built himself a memory palace to store information without even realizing it, and that's on top of his photographic memory. He blinks, perhaps realizing that he's gone off tangent, and quickly recenters himself. Apologies, yes, I care about him a great deal. I would like to see him thrive. Nezu takes his teacup back into his paw and slowly sips at it. So, Aizawa-san, either you fill out the recommendation forms for him, or I will do so myself, but I would like to avoid a scandal, so it would be much easier for both of us if you were to listen to me. The worst thing is that, after Nezu's whole speech laying out his reasoning and backing it up with facts, Shota still wants to argue with the rat just to be petty. He's been training and instructing both Izuku and Shinso in preparation for the public admittance exam. Now he's going to have to break the news to both of them and start mentally preparing Izuku for what the recommendation exam is going to be like. Shit. There goes any hope he'd had of sleeping tonight. His resignation must show on his face because Nezu leans back in his chair with a pleased grin. I'll handle the letters of complaint this afternoon. Go on. He makes a shooing gesture with his paw. Return to inspiring the next generation of heroes. Glaring at the rat and wishing not for the first time that his quirk allowed him to throw daggers out of his eyes, Shota leaves the office. He spends the afternoon teaching and trying to nap while his classes work on homework. The second years are mostly good kids, who keep to themselves, but the top 3 students are troublemakers if he looks away for too long, Togata especially. It's highly unlikely that there's a single person left in the school that hasn't been involved in one of his quirk-driven pranks. More than once, Shota had awoken from a nap to see a face phasing through the table, blinking and smiling up at him. Only the satisfaction of instantly turning on his own quirk, thus forcing Togata out of the table with more force than one would initially expect, kept Shota from giving him detention. But the day passes uneventfully, and Shota remains plagued by the conversation he's doomed to have tonight. It's not Friday, but Shinso is coming over per Shota's texted request at the end of lunch. He only wants to have this conversation once, and it's easy to offer up an extra day of training to soften the blow of something that's likely to knock both boys off of their balance. In fact, he's incredibly tempted to go through with the training first, but if this is going to be their new reality, then he may as well get them used to the new training regimen today, after breaking the news to them. Shota does not beat Izuku and Shinso to his apartment, which is nothing new. Izuku had had a key since he had first started middle school, and it's common practice for him and Shinso to get home and wind down from the day before Shota shows up and drags them off to the warehouse. Before he even unlocks the door, he can hear Izuku's voice from inside, bright and cheerful, likely teasing Shinso about something. Shinso isn't audible. He's usually about as expressive as Shota is, but he must say something because Izuku starts laughing after a brief lull. The folder tucked into Shota's bag suddenly feels like lead. But it's a necessity. It is, as Nezu pointed out, logical, and he's been ignoring that rationality in favor of being led by his emotions, which is something that would knock a younger Shota on his ass from shock. But younger Shota wasn't a dad, hadn't had the opportunity to watch a traumatized kid blossom into a talented, joyful, caring young man. He wants Izuku to be safe and happy, but Shota is, at his core, a logical and grounded man. He knows that sometimes, to be happy, you have to be a little unhappy first. Growth, after all, requires discomfort, and Shota hasn't been doing Izuku any favors by trying to pretend otherwise. Steeling himself, Shota unlocks the door and pushes his way inside. Coco is there to greet him as always, but her chain smoker's meow is drowned out by Izuku yelling, "Welcome home!" Shota fixes a flat look at Izuku over the half-wall separating them. "I don't think the volume is necessary, problem child." Izuku just grins in response, and Shota huffs out a breath and rolls his eyes at the cheekiness of his kid. Nudging Coco aside with his foot, Shota steps into the apartment, dropping his capture weapon onto a hook and fishing the folder from his bag as he goes. The sofa's open and inviting, but any hope that Shota had for a nap disappeared several hours ago when Nezu told him to recommend Izuku or else. Fucking rat. So he shuffles away from the temptation of the sofa and into the kitchen. He doesn't have to ask if they've eaten yet, because they've been in this routine for a year now. Shinso knows he's welcome to anything in the kitchen. He surprisingly hadn't been shy about exploring after being given permission, and he's thankfully a competent cook. Shota doesn't have to worry about coming home to a burnt-down apartment building or 2 teenage boys who have poisoned themselves in the kitchen. Notably, Shinso is also a very good kid, because he had already boiled water for tea and left it on for Shota. We're having a discussion before training, Shota says, dropping the folder onto the table before going to fix himself some tea. He chooses black. He needs the caffeine. Izuku's smile slips away, and he folds his hands on the table. He casts a sidelong look at Shinso, who frowns just a little. Are we in trouble? Shota raises his eyebrows. Do you have a reason to be in trouble? Slowly, Izuku shakes his head. Then why would you be? The last time you said that we needed to have a discussion, Shinso says, you lectured us about unsupervised quirk usage and the differences between heroism and vigilantism for an hour. He had done that. The morning after the kidnapping, Shota had sat both Izuku and Shinso down in the living room with Hisashi and Kato-san present and listed out to them the laws revolving around quirk usage with kids and unlicensed adults, and namely, that is very much so illegal and not allowed. He made absolutely sure that both boys knew that. The only reason they weren't getting charged with anything was because Shinso never used his quirk, although Shinso admitted to trying to use it multiple times, and because Izuku's quirk is well documented as being a volatile and difficult to control one when he's experiencing strong emotions. Shota had insisted that he did not, under any circumstances, want to know if Izuku had taken his gloves off himself. It was easy enough to put down in the report that they'd been taken off against his will, given everything that's known about the kidnappers and their prevalence in Izuku's past. There had also been admittedly some leeway given to them since they were the victims and their actions were in self-defense. But that hadn't stopped Shota from lecturing about vigilantism and how that is also illegal and not something either boy should look into doing in the future. This isn't a lecture, he promises, taking his cup of tea to the table. Shota pulls out a seat and flips open the dreaded folder. This is a recommendation. Izuku takes the folder when it's pushed his way and carefully reads over the first page. "Oh," he says, and his voice is relieved and not surprised. All the tension in his shoulders leaves him in a laugh. "We were wondering when you were going to do this. Aren't these due in, like, a couple weeks?" "What?" Shota blinks once, slowly, and watches Shinso lean over to read the page, too. "You knew about this?" "Well, not new," Izuku says. He pulls out the stack of papers and just pats his pockets as if looking for a pen. "It's just..." Izuku and I talk about UA a lot. Shinso supplies as he gets to his feet, walks into the living room, and promptly walks back into the kitchen with a pen. He gives the writing utensil to Izuku as he retakes his seat. "We've already read all the rules for the entrance exam, and once we figured out that we wouldn't be allowed to participate together, we started looking at the recommendation side as well." This is not at all what Shota had been expecting. He tries not to let the surprise show in his face. "And what did you determine?" he asks, sipping from his tea to keep from saying something unnecessary. "That it would make the most sense to get me into UA through recommendations," Izuku says, already flipping through the papers to find where his signature is required. "That if you didn't push for it, Nezu would." He looks up, eyes glinting with mischief. "He did, didn't he?" "I thought you wanted to go through the normal way," is all Shota says. Izuku beams. "I would normally, but it makes sense to do it this way. I mean, I'm your son, and I have a powerful quirk." He makes air quotes around it. "It would be suspicious as hell if you didn't at least try to get me in on recommendations." God, his kid is smart. Nezu's right. Quirk or not, Izuku would absolutely make a fierce hero with his brain alone. Shota turns to Shinso. "You don't seem upset." Shinso just shrugs. "Part of me is, but I also really want to shove it up the board's asses that someone without a physical quirk can pass their stupidly biased entrance exam." They've talked about the entrance exam, obviously. Shota didn't give out explicit details because that would be unfair, but he has mentioned multiple times that the exam is in favor of physical quirks and designed against mental quirks. He also had dropped hints that there's more than one way to win points, but never said in so many words that those extra points come from rescuing other examinees. He knows that Izuku figured it out a while ago. He doesn't know if Izuku shared that detail with Shinso. To look at Izuku, who is doing something that makes him uncomfortable with a smile on his face, and Shinso, who is driving forward against a system that continues to be stacked against him, Shota's never been more proud of two kids in his life. None of his now ex-first years can even hold a candle to these two. He keeps the fond smile off of his mouth, but he doubts he manages to hide the look completely, not in front of these two who've learned to read him just as well as Hisashi and Amuri can. Fair enough. When Izuku finishes signing all the forms, Shota takes the pen from him and starts to fill out his own signatures. "I'm going to start splitting you up for training, then. Izuku, you're going to start working more with Hisashi on your own quirk. Since you finished cleaning the beach, he's going to take you onto UA grounds to utilize one of their gyms. Shinso, you and I are going to start working with weapons. You're allowed 2 support items for the entrance exam." "Really?" Shinso's eyebrows go up. The rules didn't say anything about support items. Shota stares at him with a blank expression, waiting for him to cave, but of course he never does. He does stop talking, but his look is expectant, not cowed. "Rules are just as much as what's stated in them as what's not. For instance, there's nothing in UA's rules that says a person without a quirk is banned from taking the hero entrance exam. It also doesn't state that support items aren't allowed. It's just that most students don't ask for them." Leaning back in his chair, Shota watches Shinso carefully. "Quirks are tools. Simple as that. An overwhelming majority of pro heroes use support items. I do, and so does Hisashi. One of the tests for the entrance exam, though it doesn't technically award any points, is to see if students will ask to use support items. They have to be vetted by the judges panel, but yes, you're allowed to bring up to 2 with you." Shinso nods slowly. After glancing at Izuku, he grins. "So one will be the capture weapon," he says, and Shota can practically see the gears turning in his head. "What's the other one going to be?" "I haven't decided yet. Another weapon of some kind. It has to be something easy to pick up and learn, something intuitive. He has ideas, of course, but it's going to be up to Shinso's personal subconscious preferences. That's what you and I are going to be doing tonight." Izuku tilts his head, drawing Shota's attention back to him. "Hisashi has his radio show tonight. What am I going to be doing?" "The same thing." Shota shrugs. "You won't get a support item for the recommendation exam, but I want to start training you with something too. You're both leagues ahead of many first year on hand-to-hand combat, and you could probably give most of my second years a run for their money as well. The next logical step is integrating weapons." He narrows his eyes at them and stresses, "in a safe and supervised environment." "Yes, Dad." "Yes, Aizawa-san." "Good. Now go get changed. We don't have as much time tonight since Shinso still has to go home." Shota watches them rush to their feet, practically tripping over themselves as they race to Izuku's room. As soon as they're out of sight, he sips his tea and smiles to the empty room. No one at UA is going to know what hit them. All right, everyone. This concludes Chapter 18 of Swallow the Stars. Chapter 19 will be next. I hope you all are still enjoying it, as always. Thank you so much for listening.